Well, hello again, and welcome to today's segment of Red May, a month-long teach-in, a vacation from capitalism, from buzzwords like the gig economy, innovation, entrepreneur. We'll pretend for a month that the market is not the solution of the problems that the market creates. Not very difficult this month. I'll just say the words masks and ventilators, and you'll understand that just-in-time production can't create a public health system. And I've used that all the time, so I better come up with something new here. Before we get on to workers' inquiry more than ever, I'd like to clue you in as to what's up for the rest of the week. So I looked on my handy calendar here, and I find out that on Thursday, which is tomorrow at noon, we have Out of the Woods doing Hope Against Hope. And we're lucky enough to have Alyssa Battistoni as the moderator. Tomorrow night at 5 p.m., System Crash, What Next? With Doug Henwood, Jody Dean, Leo Panich, and Assad Haider. On Friday, What Was Liberalism? With Aziz Rana, Alexander Zevin, Catherine Chaput, Michael Bray as moderator, and I'll be in that one too. On Saturday, May 23rd, Bottlenecks, Choke Points, and Supply Chains. That's at 12 p.m. with Lala Khalili, Charmaine Shua, Sandro Mazzadra, Deborah Cowan, Dara Orenstein with Spencer Cox, who organizes at Amazon, as the moderator, or did. He's a radical geographer. And then at 6 p.m., Political Economy of COVID-19, Radhika Desai is going to talk to us from Manitoba and give us a kind of economic forecast for what to look forward after when the economy, quote unquote, starts up again. And we'll have responses from Charles Mudede and Chiru Chirushila. The last thing I like to say is if you enjoy these, if you want to know even more directly what's happening, subscribe to YouTube and you'll get notices in the mail of what's coming up. And also think about giving us some money. As you can imagine, there's not a lot of, well, actually there's none. There's no institutional support for Red May. You know, as one would expect with an event, one of whose slogans is be a commie for a month. So look into your pockets, look into your hearts, and then go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and click on donate. Give us what you can. We like to keep doing this madness every year. It's usually live. We have a Marxathon, which you just have to see to believe, but that's next year. So without further ado, oh, and also you can go to the YouTube description of the event. There's a link at the bottom, click on it, and you can donate through that. But now I'd like to turn the event over to the moderator. Kyle Kubler is a doctoral student in communication at the University of Washington. He's also going to be the co-host of Red May's forthcoming podcast and mediacast with Sean Landis, Cinder Block, motto, we make abstract concrete. Kyle?
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, and thanks to all the other organizers of Red May this year. It's been a really great time making the shift online, and definitely excited for the discussion today. One of the things that I just wanted to tack on to what Philip just said is I want to make another pitch to subscribing for a YouTube channel, also because if we can get to 1,000 subscribers, we get a lot better closed captioning software from YouTube, and that allows all of the events to be more accessible for everyone to appreciate and listen to. So even if you don't even like YouTube that much, you can still just subscribe to our channel. You can make an account, and it'll definitely not only help us out, but help everyone else. So today we are talking about workers' inquiry. And I wanted to just outline a little bit of how this panel is going to go. I'm going to intro, give a little blurb about the panel, intro our awesome speakers for today, and then we'll kind of go around and hear from all of them, and then take some questions and kind of have a more open forum conversation. So if you're listening and you're feeling inclined, send some questions in the YouTube chat, and we can get those answered as best as possible. So In 1880, Karl Marx created and distributed the first workers' inquiry, a 101-question survey pursuing details on working and social conditions straight from the lives of proletarianized workers. As it's told, not a single response was returned. Since then, around the globe, the workers' inquiry has been a tool among workers and left researchers and journalists to aid in the development of class consciousness, organization, and the abolition of capital. As reported by Robert Ovetz's new collection, Workers' Inquiry and Global Class Struggle, quote, by engaging in what Karl Marx called a workers' inquiry, workers and militant co-researchers are studying their working conditions, the technical composition of capital, and how to recompose their own power in order to devise new tactics, strategies, organizational forms, and objectives. These workers' inquiries, from call center workers to platform, trucking, cleaning, logistics, mining, auto factories, teachers, and adjunct professors, are re-energizing unions, bypassing unions altogether, or innovating new forms of worker organizations. Today on our panel, we have Jamie Woodcock, who is an academic and organizer. He's the editor of Notes from Below and Historical Materialism. Lydia Hughes, an editor from Notes from Below and an organizer at a trade union. Michelle Chen, a contributing writer for The Nation. She is also a contributing editor at Dissent magazine and a contributing writer at In These Times. She is also the co-producer of Asia Pacific Forum on Pacifica's WBAI and Dissent's Belabored podcast. Robert Ovetz is a lecturer in political science at San Jose State University. Robert's first book is When Workers Shot Back, Class Conflict from 1877 to 1924, out in Haymarket Press. His second book, which we just talked about, Workers' Inquiry and Class Struggle, Tactics, Strategies, Objectives, will be published by Pluto Press later this year. He's currently working on a third book, A Class Analysis of the U.S. Constitution. He lives in Marin County, California. Sarah Jaffe is a reporting fellow at the New Media Center, the Type Media Center, and the co-host of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Guardian, The American Prospect, The New Republic, and many other publications. Her first book, Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, was called by Robin D.G. Kelly as, quote, the most compelling social and political portrait of our age. She is currently finishing her second book titled Work Won't Love You Back, out in January 2021 from Bold Type Books. So with that, we're going to kick off the discussion and I will hand it over to Robert.
The last few months have been an extraordinary example of what I call the working class pandemic. Naomi Klein famously describes how during times of crisis in her book, The Shock Doctrine, that corporations and the state will push through things that they otherwise can't get done in normal times. What she's overlooked is that in these same times of crisis, the working class also has an incredible opportunity to also get things done, to make changes, to transform the state, to shift the way that work is organized, that otherwise is unsuccessful in normal times. And the last couple of months are a good demonstration of this. During this terrible time of the pandemic, in the United States alone, according to Payday Report, there have been over 200 wildcat strikes around the country. In fact, there's one that's happening right now around the country in numerous states, completely autonomously self-organized, and that's by truckers, independent truckers, whose work has been transformed over the last half century from being heavily unionized, well-paid, very powerful, under a powerful union of the Teamsters, to essentially being gig workers, contract workers, who now have found a new kind of power to actually disrupt the infrastructure of the United States. There's also been some other examples of self-organizing among workers. Many of these workers forgotten by unions or given up on in the gig sector, including working for Amazon or Whole Foods or Target's home delivery service, Instacart, as well as healthcare workers who've been engaged in numerous protests and strikes, prisoners, and almost also incredibly catastrophically, workers in the slaughterhouses all over the country who've been so successful, although they've been hit hard from over 12,000 catching the terrible COVID-19 virus and dozens of them dying. They've been incredibly successful in their demands for less work and more pay and safer working conditions, that they've shut down half of the meat production of pork and almost as much of beef in the entire country. This has resulted in a response from the Trump administration to essentially invoke a Cold War era law called the Defense Production Act in order to take over and force these companies to keep operating. This wave of wildcat strikes around the country demonstrates something quite extraordinary, and something that I think Workers' Inquiry can actually be very valuable in helping us understand how these struggles are being organized, their impacts, and how we can develop new tactics and strategies in the class struggle. I think that we can already see some examples of the impact of how class struggle drives change in the state and reform. That's something that I talk about in my first book, When Workers Shot Back, and is also going to feature quite prominently in the book that I edited, Global Workers Inquiry and Global Class Struggle. I should remember the title of it. It's coming out in January. And the basic premise that I make in my first book is that the periods of reform that we've seen in US history were not the prompting of renewed cycles of class struggle, but were actually the result of those struggles. We can see some examples of this in the United States with the passage of the CARES Act, for example. Over $3 trillion in direct fiscal aid to corporations to essentially pay the salaries of workers, also to pad their bottom line. But also a good chunk of it, not including what the Fed is spending, which we don't entirely know yet, but a good chunk of that $3 trillion actually went to increasing unemployment by 133%, quite an extraordinary jump for a program that hasn't seen an increase in quite a long time. Also, the first ever paid family and sick leave after decades of campaigning and efforts by nonprofits and advocacy groups. They've accomplished none of that, although at a few state levels. These were, you could say, preemptory, precautionary measures to prepare the state for what is going to come. And indeed, it did come. Since March, those over 200 wildcat strikes have been predicated upon not only raising wages, but also improving working conditions, making work safer. And I look forward to Sarah's book about work that's coming up. Because what's extraordinary is the outcome, even though unemployment has shot up probably to about 30%, is that these struggles have resulted in raising wages and reducing productivity. In other words, more work for less pay. What can we learn from this? And what does Workers' Inquiry have that can teach us about what these struggles mean and what we can learn from them? I want to just take a moment to talk about what is meant by Workers' Inquiry. Workers' Inquiry essentially is something that, as you pointed out at the start, Kyle, that was really coined by Marx in one of his last ever writings, which he presumably never got a response to. And that was a survey of about 100 questions in order to understand and explore what's called the class composition. In other words, how is capital organized? How are workers organized in the workplace? And how does capital structure the rest of society? The class composition is something that I call class composition theory, and it actually was rediscovered starting in the 1950s by groups simultaneously in France and Italy, and was further developed through the 1970s also by a US group that put out a journal called Zero Work. It's a little bit hard to see, but I actually have an original poster from Zero Work to my right. And it kind of died out for several decades. It was kind of forgotten. And with the efforts of a few scattered folks, some of whom we're going to hear from Notes from Below colleagues, it's experiencing a rejuvenation. What does class composition theory have to teach us? Well, using the methodology of Marx, it helps us understand how capital is organized in the workplace. In other words, what is called the technical composition, which is how is work organized? What's the relationship between workers of different skills and wage levels? Understanding those work relationships can help us understand how capital has responded to previous cycles of struggle and reorganized and rationalized the work process in order to decompose the class composition of workers, in order to weaken them, to divide them, separate them, in order to control and reimpose work on those workers. So the technical composition of capital is how capital is currently organized in response to previous cycles of struggle. Workers are also organized. We talk about this as the recomposition of work of the working class. So how do workers respond to that current technical composition, which is dismantled and suppressed and disorganized those previous cycles of class struggle? How can they overcome that? Workers' inquiry teaches us how we study the new relationship of work. The different technologies, the work processes, the management strategies, to understand how to adapt to that defeat of previous cycles of struggle in order to develop new tactics and strategies, and to shift and change our objectives for how workers can organize to realize their demands. To whether that be democratizing the work process, raising wages, or more extensively, actually engaging in revolutionary struggle. Now, in the process of the recomposition of worker struggle, capital is also attempting to respond to that by finding new management strategies, technologies, and tactics in order to counter and defeat these new tactics and strategies of workers. And if it's successful in doing so, it engages in what we call the decomposition of class struggle. And when capital is successful in decomposing class struggle, it imposes a new technical composition. So to kind of put this into real terms, the last 50 years that is more commonly known as neoliberalism is actually the imposition of a new technical composition of capital. The dismantling of the previous, you could say, social pacts in which higher wages were traded for less control over work and higher productivity. In other words, a larger share of the pie going to workers and the working class in the form of social democracy, of various kinds of so-called welfare or social service programs, and higher wages and shorter work weeks. That was all thrown out starting back about 50 years ago in response to the last cycle of struggle in the 60s and 70s. What we're now experiencing is a change in the technical composition through the introduction of information technology and big data and other technologies. And what we're seeing happening during the pandemic right now is a massive acceleration of the imposition of this new technical composition. For example, in the area where I primarily focus on of higher education and public education, by moving hundreds of millions of students into online education. I'll talk about that more later on. So essentially, a workers' composition can occur from above in collaboration and cooperation with workers on the shop floor, so to speak, or it can be something that's done in cooperation in conjunction with workers by, say, academics or freelance intellectuals, or the workers studying the technical composition of capital themselves in order to inform their new tactics and strategies and objectives. So in workers' inquiries, we talk about it from above, or workers' inquiries from below. I think what is also really exciting about workers' inquiries is in the current phase of how they're being used is as a tool of class struggle that connects us not only across individual workplaces, within workplaces and individual workplaces, and across sectors or companies or employers, but also across different nations. There's a renewed interest in workers' inquiry and the development of a new network in which I participate, the Workers' Inquiry Network, to connect these kinds of struggles in an attempt to realize something that Ed Emery first proposed back in the 1990s in a journal that's no longer around called Common Sense. And Ed Emery famously put it that there should be no politics without inquiry. And he called for a global workers' inquiry or a cooperation in order to develop, if you will, a library of how workers are studying the technical composition of capital in order to recompose their struggles. And what's really exciting about this time around in the developments of workers' inquiry is that there's actually a network of people who are doing these in different countries, particularly in Latin America and to some degree in Africa and India and in Europe and North America. Through the Workers' Inquiry Network and also through an online magazine called Fever Struggle, where different groups that are engaged in doing workers' inquiries are actually cooperating to provide news and analysis about these struggles. There are also some individuals that are also carrying out workers' inquiry and using this not as an academic exercise, but by applying it in their own work in academia or in cooperation in what is sometimes called militant co-inquiry. For example, Lorenza Monaco and in Italy and the UK and South Africa, who's done some amazing work also in India, and Anna Curcio in Italy. And both of them also have pieces in the edited book that Pluto is putting out in January. And Lorenza brings back this original vision of Ed Emery, that we need this kind of global workers' inquiry, because let's face it, there's no debate anymore that essentially our planet is toast unless we're able to transform the way that our global society functions. And really at the heart of the problem is capitalism and the endless imposition of work that is creating the multitude of grand crises that put much of the biological life in our ecosystem at risk. The answer needs to be in figuring out how people are organizing, not just to raise wages, but actually organizing in order to seize control over how we organize society and produce and relate and reproduce ourselves. And what's most exciting about what's been happening in the last couple of months is that really for the first time, we're starting to see an expansion of these struggles around a sector of capitalism that really gets a short shrift, and that's reproductive labor. Many of these wildcat strikes that I started off talking about are really about reproductive labor. The hidden, if you will, source of profit in capitalism, the work that goes essentially unpaid. And it's those workers who are doing this reproductive labor that was moved increasingly out of the household, the unwaged housework, for example, and the kinds of work that goes into reproducing workers' labor power to go back to work the next day, of healthcare and food and housing and the emotional labor as well. Those workers now that are in the wage sector are really at the forefront of showing how well-organized workers self-organize in the workplace and connecting themselves to their communities have a great potential to disrupt at critical choke points the global economy. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And I think workers' inquiry has a lot to teach us about it.
Great, thanks, Robert. All right, now we'll turn it over to Jamie and Lydia from Notes from Below.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting us to come and speak here. It's always a pleasure to come and speak about workers' inquiry. What we thought we would do from Notes from Below is have me talk for a little bit about the kind of background to the project and some of the things that we've done. And then Lydia's going to introduce some more contemporary stuff that we're doing with Notes from Below. So we're going to kind of tag team the Notes from Below project via Zoom, which I'm sure will work smoothly and fine. I guess, Robert did a very good job of providing an introduction and so on, but I think I wanted to start in a slightly different, from a slightly different position to talk a little bit about workers' inquiry, which is something we've kind of struggled with Notes from Below and thought about, and I think kind of motivates kind of our interest in inquiry in many ways. Is, as we've kind of mentioned, this initial inquiry by Marx with way too many questions that we don't know if anybody ever actually filled out or so on, is a kind of a really important starting point, I think, in lots of ways, because Marx writes a very short introduction to it, and in that introduction he lays out what for me is the kind of the basic premise of workers' inquiry, which is that he's written Capital, unfortunately not as many volumes as we might have wanted him to. He's done that theoretical work, and he's now saying, I want to try and put that theory and theorization of capital into the contact of workers' experience. I want to understand capital through workers' actual lived experience in the factories and in workplaces. And I think that on its own is a kind of a good enough starting point. But he also lays out that workers are the people who can understand this experience. They're the people who can describe their experiences of work in a way that no one else can, which I always think as an academic is a really important reminder. There are already people out there who know a huge amount about work because they have to do those jobs every day and so on. But Marx continues to say it's only them who can change their conditions, not saviors sent by providence. And so for me, that is the kind of the fundamental starting point of workers' inquiry, is that yes, it involves some research, but what it has at its core is trying to organize to overcome those conditions, whether those are conditions in a particular workplace, in a sector, or against capital more widely. And so from that kind of starting point, what we try to do at Notes from Below, and many other people have done, is to kind of pick over the traditions of workers' inquiry, of different people who have attempted to connect workers' actual experience with a kind of working class politics. And I guess I would add to Robert's introduction also the Johnson Forrest tendency in the US and their kind of experience with worker writing. And this is something we've tried to think about. How do you help people to write about their conditions as the kind of first step in an inquiry? And so we've been very pleased at Notes from Below to be able to publish lots of different kind of original pieces of worker writing, sometimes with minimal editing, sometimes with a lot more editing and working through stuff and so on. And I think, for us as a project, this is both about inquiries from above, as Robert outlined in a really helpful way. Workers' inquiry can be a tool to get us into connection with workers in different sectors. If we think a kind of work is important to try and organize in, we can use these as the kind of initial steps for making contact with people. And I think in a way, if we think about it, there is kind of implicit workers' inquiry that happens all the time. The first day somebody goes to work, they have to figure out how the workplace operates, what's expected, where they can bend the rules, how to take a longer break and so on. And in lots of trade union activity, this process is also there. Trying to understand the conditions in order to figure out a way to go beyond them. But for us at Notes from Below, this kind of project of doing inquiry has been about trying to turn those implicit moments into something more explicit, to be able to share the stories of how work is changing in different places and how people are struggling, in order to learn, to circulate those experiences and those kind of stories of what works and hopefully not as often, but what doesn't work. And so as a project, we think about workers' inquiry, I guess, as the tools, doing the interviews, doing co-writing, helping people to write their own stories and experiences up, is the kind of a toolbox of different methods. And we haven't used 100 question surveys as of yet, but at least we know we've got that up our sleeve. And as Robert kind of explained, this is where we connect workers' inquiry to theories of class composition. Is if workers' inquiry is about how we take the experience of work, try and understand it, try and explore it and describe it and so on. Class composition is how we try to analyze those inquiries, how they fit into a broader picture of capitalism today. And so we take this understanding, beginning with this idea of technical composition, as Robert has outlined, of like the material details of work. Like, what is your work like? How is it organized? How does the manager treat you? What kind of technology is being used? The kind of traditional workplace study objects, I guess. How is work organized by capital in various ways? But one of the things we've really worked on at Notes from Below is to think about how we can update that framework for today. So traditionally, people understood the technical composition and then the political composition. How do workers respond, resist, organize? What kind of forms does this take? But we've increasingly in our inquiries drawn attention to factors beyond the workplace. So what we call social composition. So trying to understand how aspects like housing, the role of the state, oppression, communities, pre-existing networks, how all of these things play a role in how people make the leap from how their work is organized technically to how they recompose politically in various ways. And in particular, we've used this with gig inquiries into gig work to make sense of roots of migration and linguistic groups and so on, and how that feeds into the ways people are able to successfully resist and organize. Throughout Notes from Below, we've been trying to kind of experiment with these things. So think about the different forms that inquiries that feed into these things can take. But I think the kind of overriding politics of the project has been about trying to make sense of how workers' experience and workers' writing can feed into a kind of analysis of capitalism today and a set of struggles against it. What I'm going to do, perhaps we can come back to some of the stuff in the questions and so on, but is to kind of make this point that workers' experience really matters. It matters how people experience capital. It matters how people experience work. And this is the kind of building blocks for a politics that could come out of the workers' movement today. But I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'm going to hand over to Lydia to talk a bit about how we've actually tried to put this into practice.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I'll just shuffle up so you can hear me better. And thank you so much for the invite to participate in this session. I know it was due to go ahead in person, but slightly luckily for us, it's digitally, so we can participate from London. And thanks so much, Jamie and Robert as well, for that really great introduction into workers' inquiry. What I'm going to talk very briefly about is a project recently that we've launched as Notes from Below and our new workers' inquiry grant. As Robert mentioned, there's this increasing interest in workers' inquiry, something that's really, really exciting. And we wanted to capitalize on this in the UK and launch a network of workers who are interested in workers' inquiry and need that space to develop those ideas, practice workers' inquiry, and also talk to other workers who are doing similar things. So recently we've launched a series of workshops as a space for workers to meet and exchange ideas, plan inquiries, but also most importantly, discuss their work and find commonalities with other workers who may be in totally different sectors, but find like real commonalities between them. I think it was in our first session where there were workers in the hospitality industry, workers who are medical careers, workers who are care workers, and they found so many common aspects across their industries things to do with surveillance at work, increasing use of technologies to survey people at work. So it's a really important space for people to really bring out those ideas and gain confidence doing inquiry. But most importantly, it was a great space to talk about organizing as well, share experiences of organizing, and think of a common way that we can write about it in our work of writing. We managed to have one physical meeting before the crisis hit, but now we've gone digital with those workshops. But this is also a call out of, we're really happy to share the workshop plans if people want to do similar models across the world. It'd be amazing to see these kind of workshops happening all across the world. And as Robert mentioned, we recently launched an international workers' inquiry network, which consists of us at Notes from Below, but also groups and individuals doing really similar work across the world, which has been a great space to really develop workers' inquiry further. As well as running this series of workshops, we've had it go alongside the launching of the Workers' Inquiry grant at Notes from Below. We've got about 10 grants to give workers to do their own in-depth workers' inquiries. As editors, we try and support them as much as we can, being on the other end of the phone, just chatting through ideas, but also reading drafts, discussing theory, and just discussing work together. The money, while it can cover any lost wages that you'll incur whilst writing or other forms of workers' inquiry, it also can cover expenses, just like going out for a coffee with your colleagues and chatting about work, and anything that can support people doing workers' inquiries. And it's so important, I think, what Jamie raised of the real importance of worker writing. It's not only do workers have the knowledge to change their work, but also the power. And that's what we're really trying to encourage those applying for the grant to think about and to empower them with. And I really want to emphasize one last thing, which you also mentioned, Jamie. I really feel like this cannot be stressed enough in a workshop about workers' inquiry, that the point of workers' inquiry is not just to write about work or to come up with working class knowledge about work today. The point is to organize. The point is to use that knowledge with your colleagues to organize, whether it's in a union or not in a union. The point is really to change your work. It's not a kind of academic discipline where we can think abstractly about work, but it's a space to actively change it. And with that, I want to do just a little call out to finish off with. We have a couple of grants left, and we really want to find amazing people who want to write about their work. Maybe you don't feel that confident at the moment. Lots of people who write for Notes from Below maybe don't to begin with. But by putting you in touch with other people in our network and hopefully discussing with you further and looking at what you've come up with, we can develop some really strong workers' inquiry, especially in this incredibly important time, more than ever. So if you want any of our workshop plans or to inquire more about the grant, definitely get in touch with us at Notes from Below. And I'll leave it at that, but hopefully there'll be some good questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks to both of you. And now we'll turn it over to Sarah and Michelle.
Hello. So it's kind of fun to be on this panel because I'm a labor journalist, and I had only learned about the idea of workers' inquiry fairly recently. I mean, I'm one of those annoying people who will always point out that Marx was a journalist too, among many other things. So that's a thing. But so Michelle and I are also doing a belabored live, virtually live now for Red May next week with Cal Winslow, which is going to be great fun, I think. And so we're here because we do a labor podcast, in addition to writing things about labor that both of us can talk about individually. This podcast is coming up on its 200th episode, which is a lot considering we do it every 2 weeks. We used to do it weekly at the beginning. back in 2012 when I got annoyed at something on the internet and made a joke to Sarah Leonard, who was then the editor at Dissent, about wanting to start a labor podcast with Josh Idelson, which then we were like, hey, maybe we could do that. And we did. Dissent came up with some money and Josh and I came up with some time, and we started doing this thing that is basically still in the same format now that it was back 8 years ago, almost. That's nuts. Actually, I should look up exactly what date we launched on. But so one of the reasons that we wanted to do a podcast was that it's differently accessible to people, right? You can listen to something when you're in the car, as I pull my headphones out, when you're in the car, when you're at work. There were things that, when I used to work in a bicycle shop, working with my hands all day, you'd have the radio on. That's a great thing to listen to while you're working. For people who work at a desk, it's easy to read an article in between, goofing off while you're at work. But if you do a different kind of work, perhaps you could get your news and information by listening to it. Also, because some of the people that I would talk to while reporting some of these stories were just incredible. And it's very, very hard to make that come across in the same way on a piece of paper as it does when you listen to somebody talk. I think about, one of the things that the coronavirus killed this spring actually was my plan to go do a podcast in Indiana on the carrier plant workers that Donald Trump sort of famously obsessed over back when he was first getting elected. And partly just because I really wanted to have Chuck Jones narrate a podcast because he's got the greatest voice. So we thought about podcasting as a way to make something for working people, as well as, rather than a lot of journalism about labor and a lot of academic writing about labor, which is essentially studying working people to be presented for the consumption of the upper middle classes, we wanted to make something that could be useful to workers. So this week we're recording, shortly after we get off of this call, actually, a Know Your Rights episode about labor law in the US for people who are being pressured to go back to work when they're, justifiably afraid of what their working conditions might look like. So we talk to workers, organizers, historians, legal experts, all sorts of people to try to put together something that is useful, again, as Jamie and Lydia were saying, to people who are organizing on the job. And yeah, I've been a labor journalist now for over a decade, full-time since somewhere around 2009. And I was inspired to do that because there was very little of it at the time. Even in the supposedly progressive press, we were in sort of the Bush era, the, after 9/11 anti-war movement. The criticisms of the structures of capitalism were mostly about, Halliburton profiting off of the occupation of Iraq, not the working conditions in, Walmart. So other than a couple of very notable exceptions to that rule, like Liza Featherstone and of course, Barbara Ehrenreich, most people weren't writing about working people's lives. And one of the struggles that I have had continually in trying to be a labor journalist is, again, that push to write stories about working people for the consumption of somebody who can never picture having been working class. And I worked in restaurants for most of a decade. I worked on bicycles. I've picked up garbage for a living. So it's meaningful to me to say that this is, when I'm writing a story about working people, I want it to be for those people. And I'm crowing a little bit this week because of one Kroger worker that I spoke to, who then introduced me to another Kroger worker, Kroger's a grocery store for those who are not familiar. Because of that, I found out that Kroger was sending out letters to its workers saying, oh, we've overpaid you your emergency pay and we need you to pay it back. And I was like, what the hell? And so we wrote about it. We published a piece at Dissent. And because of that piece, apparently, Kroger has now backed down and is not asking workers to pay that back anymore. And the great thing about that story was the flood of emails that we got. Michelle and I have a belabored email address, and we just got this sort of flood of stories from workers at Kroger, sending us pictures, sending us poetry in one case. This guy wrote amazing poetry illustrated with emoji, which makes me very happy. And that's what we do it for, right? That's why I got into this, is I want the people who I'm writing about to be the people that are reading it and sharing it and finding that useful. So I have not theorized that heavily as Workers' Inquiry, although I think it certainly fits into this framework. And with that, I'm gonna toss it to Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Okay, let me remember to unmute myself. Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes. Yeah, I would second everything that Sarah has said. She, this both the Belabored podcast itself, as well as the initial sort of germ of the Belabored Story series, were both sort of random things that came out of conversations with Sarah. So full credit to her for that. But I came along starting to do the podcast. I took over for Josh Idelson kind of in the middle of getting my PhD. And at that point I was doing a doctorate in history. And I think I've always been sort of surprised about how, about the intersections between journalism, or at least the type of journalism that I like to do and I like to read, and academic inquiry, but also at how much the academic world fails to really kind of incorporate some of the most basic lessons of journalism that I think that many academics could really benefit from. For instance, talking to your subjects rather than reading about them, and actually making sure that even in the social sciences, where I think you could probably find the most perhaps the most apt contemporary analogy to the workers' inquiry in terms of doing ethnographies of work and ethnographies of workers. There's often sort of a level of abstraction, and also kind of a risk of running into this problem that I think Jamie and Lydia raised earlier, which is, are we acquiring knowledge for knowledge's sake, or are we actually going to do something with these narratives that we are collecting? And I also feel that in some ways academics, on the one hand, they're sort of they can be guilty of over theorizing things, but on the other hand, they can be surprisingly unaware of how much of themselves that they inject in some sort of research inquiry about a subject that maybe shares very little of their life experience. And I think that being a journalist is pretty good training for sort of acquiring a kind of humility that you need in order to really effectively navigate these worlds, which may or may not sort of dovetail with your own experience. Having having been a worker and actually being a member of the precarious academic labor force now, I sometimes do feel quite close to the subjects that I write about. Maybe even to the extent that at times I feel like I don't even realize this until I'm halfway through writing an article that I actually have a lot in common with someone I'm writing about, more than perhaps I'm ever willing to admit to myself in some ways. I think that the practice of journalism, which sort of emphasizes doing a kind of inquiry that is also accessible, can be really useful in that regard. I also think that the focus on narrative, we live in a moment in popular culture where there's a lot of focus on personal narrative, and a lot of focus on sort of self-reflection in a way that is facilitated by social media, and is encouraged by certain aspects of popular culture, particularly sort of the cultural self-help, that can often lead narrative to be something that is kind of politically flaccid, not very intellectually rigorous, and I think that not all forms of narrative are created equal as well. And so when we think about ways to either do labor journalism effectively or to do academic inquiry effectively when studying the workplace or studying workplace dynamics, it's also important to keep in mind that there are also forces that are kind of militating against the working class in our society that try to use tools of narrative to manipulate workers, to kind of flatten their narratives, to erase kind of class consciousness in some ways. There's a lot of emphasis on this thing called worker voice now in both academic literature and to some extent in politics. You hear it come up more, I think, in in sort of Obama era discourse about labor law. And I always sort of wonder about that, and I kind of interrogate the use of the term worker voice. Who is doing the speaking in that worker voice? What is it mediated through? And so I think that when we talk about the voice of workers, it's sort of it behooves us to kind of approach that with the sort of with the kind of humility, I guess. In terms of my own work, I think I did a lot of my academic work without reading through a lot of primary sources, and it always came across as quite interesting to me that workers were often articulating their own narratives without necessarily framing it in terms of a formal inquiry. They were just sort of writing about their lives, and I think that sometimes the idea of an inquiry can become a little bit belabored, to paraphrase, in some ways. I think what I like about the medium of podcasting, and I've been doing audio journalism for almost as long as I've been doing regular journalism, is that you do hear sort of the unmediated voice of workers in that, or anyone you're interviewing for that matter. And there's something so much more visceral about the way people connect to a voice over audio, even a faceless voice. In some cases, I think the voice alone is actually a lot more effective than a video of someone. So I think in terms of relating to finding forms of journalism that can be both accessible as well as informative, and can actually help inform some of our overall political discourse around labor organizing. I also think that perhaps moving beyond the written word and thinking about other ways that workers can connect and tell their own stories is also very useful, particularly in an age where we live in a world where the scope and the sort of the dynamism of our media is no longer as constrained as it was, certainly in the days of when Marx was doing his original inquiry, and even in the 20th century. So we have more tools for storytelling, but I also think that the idea of storytelling, as some have pointed out, can be a little bit problematic in and of itself, right? If things are only relegated to their almost storytelling, we have to think more critically, I think, about how to what we want to do with that knowledge, right? And also give workers the space to kind of articulate for themselves, how they see themselves as agents in their lives, right? What they see as the role of the workplace in their own lives, and sometimes it won't necessarily match up with what the originator of the inquiry is expecting. And I think that whether you're an academic or you're a labor journalist, it's also important to let those stories kind of breathe on their own, and see what comes out of them, rather than jump too quickly to put an interpretive lens on it.
Great, yeah, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists for getting us started in this discussion. I think there's a lot of ground to cover, and there's like lots of different components of this conversation that have been addressed. So I'm definitely excited to sort of explore all those a little bit more. So I wanted to start off with a question for Robert, which, and again, anyone can answer this, as well if you want to chime in. But I think my first question is sort of like, why workers' inquiry now? So you mentioned that obviously we went back to the 1880s with Marx to talk about this sort of original survey. And then you sort of mentioned a period of decades where the idea hadn't really been picked up so much, but that like clearly with all the work that so many panelists are doing, or all of our panelists are doing right now, it seems like there's a certain resurgence in workers' inquiry. But it also strikes me as sort of resurging at the same time that many of the large social struggles that we've seen in the world around, whether it's in Chile or France or Hong Kong, have also been around where people are meeting each other in the streets, not as workers, but under other forms of social cohesion. And it's so clearly these things are not antagonistic, but I'm curious if there's like a way that you see workers' inquiry sort of coming to its own again now, while at the same time having to deal with these social struggles that maybe aren't as coherent along the lines of workplace or labor, something like that.
I think Jamie, you put it really well when I've heard you speak, and I think that if I could just paraphrase you for a moment, I think the question is work. We live in a capitalist society, and we often overlook the reality that much of the way that life is organized is related to work. And for the last few generations, if you will, most of the focus has been turned out of the workplace and away from those relationships of exploitation of labor and into what is called social movements, mobilizing, advocacy, moving into the streets. And we've overlooked that where power is really asserted in a capitalist system is in where labor exists, both wage and unwaged labor. And we have suffered terribly because of that. The last 50 years, I don't have to tell anybody on this panel, and probably, I don't know who's listening, but many of you are probably quite aware of the endless levels of defeat that we've experienced, not only in the United States, but around the world. Things have just gotten worse. And the answers that have been given to us are really based on this idea that comes out of pluralism, of coalitions and advocacy and organizing and social movements. And to be frank, most of them have failed utterly. And as somebody who has worked in social movements, I worked in NGO advocacy. I ran an advocacy group, an environmental ocean conservation group. These models have utterly failed. And I think workers' inquiry gives us some of the tools that Jamie was talking about for us to really understand why we're being defeated, to inform ourselves about how capitalism has transformed itself to essentially claw back many of the successes and advances previous waves of class struggle have resulted in. These tools can help us understand how we have to develop tactics and strategies in order to move us further along before essentially our planet is toast. And the only way that we can really advance those kinds of changes that are really desperately needed is they have to be anchored in around work and around capitalism. And I think on another level also is that what we call the labor movement has really also failed to adapt its tactics and strategies to changes in work. And I was really struck by something that Michelle, you had just said about, when you're talking to precarious workers as a fellow academic, it kind of dawns on you that actually we have more in common as precarious academics, you and I, with our students, with people you're interviewing, with people we interact with in our everyday lives, than we have differences. And one thing that really stands out is really how utterly clueless, to be frank. Many of the academic labor unions have been about the changes in education, in academia, not just in K-12 in the United States, but in higher education as well. This move towards the supermajority of faculty, over 70%, being precarious gig workers, effectively, like myself. Where in England they call it 0-hour contracts. Essentially, when there's no work, you don't have a job, you don't have an income. And we really have to kind of take a step back and look at whether it's education or it's in the retail sector or healthcare, and look at how the reorganization of work really underlies why our tactics and strategies have utterly failed. And I think workers' inquiry and the use of class composition theory to understand what we're learning about work can help us develop the kinds of tactics and strategies that can connect these different movements that are going on in Lebanon, in Chile, in Iraq, in Iran, in Europe, United States, Latin America, all over Latin America in the last year or so, so that we can cross those kinds of divides and figure out how our struggles can circulate and connect with one another. I think that it's really a question of tactics and strategies, and workers' inquiry and class composition theory provides us the tools and the analytical framework to be able to understand what we need to do in order to be more effective.
Great. Does anyone else want to add on to that? Cool. Great. So next question I have is for Jamie and Lydia. So I wanted to sort of talk about particularly the work that Notes from Below has done around gig work and organizing there. The organization obviously had lots of coverage around gig worker strikes in 2018. And sort of from a few years ago. And I'm curious about how you see some of those gig work strikes and struggles from a few years ago sort of carrying over into the way that the work stoppages and strikes have happened in sort of in response to the pandemic. And so are there differences between those two movements that you've seen? And then also, were some of the efforts that you were able to make, some of the inroads into gig workers there, have those sort of carried over and helped build a foundation for what struggle looks like now?
Yes, I think that's it's a really excellent question. I mean, we've been doing inquiry of a sort with gig workers in London since 2016. So it's been quite a long-term project. It's involved helping to write workplace bulletins for delivery riders with one of our other editors, co-writing with people, things written individually and so on. And I think what we've really seen is a kind of long-term kind of tracing this stuff since before there were strikes that happened in the UK. So the first strike was in the summer in 2016. And so we've really seen big shifts in how these workers are found to strike, to resist, to organize, and so on. And I think there's a couple of observations that like lead into what's happening more generally now, which I think are kind of useful. And the first one is, I remember having a conversation with a mainstream trade union official around the same time as the strikes first happened. He said these workers will never be able to organize. You won't be able to find them. They're so geographically dispersed. They don't know each other. And I kind of quipped to him, you know, we could order a pizza and have one here in 5 minutes. We could have another one here just after. And he said, you know, don't be glib. You know, they'll never figure out how to organize. Then they had a massive 7-day strike a couple of weeks later, a strike wave that spread across Europe. And I think what's really interesting about this is that I think there are 3 broad observations, if I can take enough time to answer it. The first is that these workers know each other. You know, they hang around outside restaurants, they join WhatsApp groups, they come from similar migrant groups. They already have quite dense networks that they are able to use to take action. The second is the kind of contractual trick of the gig economy, of this kind of bogus self-employment. In the UK, at least, can be turned into a bit of a strength for many of these workers. That they don't have to go through traditional balloting processes. They can just down tools, they can stop driving, stop delivering. And because the company won't negotiate with them, because they don't want to look like an employer, there's no like release valve between no action and taking a big strike. So you get these kind of big moments of antagonism that come to the surface. And then the third one, which I think kind of feeds into what's happening today, is these companies, particularly like Uber and Deliveroo and so on, in trying to convince people that the Uber driver is a new, new kind of contractor, new flexible agent and so on, have really built this kind of worker subjectivity that people share in South Africa, in India, in the US, in the UK, in all these different countries. And so these workers find ways to share stories and get in touch with each other and start organizing. So in a kind of strange way, this attempt to decompose workers all over the world has ended up laying the basis for them to build much, much stronger connections. I would say I'm slightly reluctant to read too clearly into what's happening right now, because in the UK, gig workers are, they are resisting in various ways, but also we're having, drivers die from contracting COVID, not being provided with PPE. Is very much these are workers in the UK that have been like pushed onto the front lines, and that's an incredibly difficult thing to go through during a pandemic.
No, I think you've covered it.
Yeah, great. So I wanted to address the next question to Sarah and Michelle, particularly sort of just speaking around some of the differences between labor journalism and workers' inquiry, because it seems like they, again, like I don't actually think that they're that they're like trying to do different things necessarily, or like achieving different aims. Like there's obviously many more similarities than differences, but I do think there are like some differences, and I think that it seems like each of them have some of their advantages and disadvantages. So I'd like to sort of have a conversation about that, particularly around like how the two can work together, how they sort of fit into this piece about worker struggle. So I'm curious if there are certain things that you see about like labor journalism that are achieved in different ways than workers' inquiry, or ways that they can kind of work together.
I mean, the biggest thing is that journalism is my job. I do this for wages, and because of that, it is shaped by the conventions and the structures of the places that are willing to pay me to do it. So I come into this as a worker. This is what I do for a living. When I'm writing a book, luckily I sold a few copies of my first book, and so I get a little bit of leeway on writing my book how I want to write it this time around. And so I can do the kind of reporting and storytelling more the way I want to do it. But, for a lot of the stories that I'm writing right now, I'm writing what somebody wants to pay me to do. And so that's not an organizing practice. That's my job. I believe in my job. I do this job rather than other ones that would probably pay me more. I twice turned down jobs where I would have been essentially writing hot takes on the daily news so that I could keep doing this work because I think it matters. But it's not something that I consider like my contribution to radical politics. Instead, I'm writing about other people's contribution to radical politics. I'm writing about people's organizing. And I'm doing that in a sort of conscious way to say, like, here is what, for instance, this Union of Kroger Workers won. Here are these building service workers in New York who are on strike right now. Here is why they went on strike. Here are what their working conditions are. Sorry, my dog is having a panic attack over in the corner. And that is, hopefully it's useful to other people organizing, but sorry, dog, kind of don't think that, really? Not now. He's protesting his working conditions currently. He doesn't get paid enough for his emotional labor. But so that question of like, what would I do differently if I were doing this, like just purely as an attempt to organize workers versus like, you know, having to write the article that the New Republic or the Nation wants to pay me for, is an interesting question that I would have to spend some time thinking about. And I'm going to mute myself because this dog is being annoying and let Michelle answer this.
Yes, I'll intervene due to the doggy panic attack. I would generally agree that, you know, I think the thing about labor journalism is that it is essentially one type of worker writing about another type of worker. So I suppose in that sense, it is. I would also say that journalism itself, it has it generally has a different audience, I would say, than a lot of academic work, and if workers' inquiry to some extent is either used for organizing purposes or for the production of academic text, then I think that labor journalism does come from a different place, in the sense that it is we are sort of all selling our stories at the end of the day, whether we like it or not. So that is that means in some ways that journalists, by some measures, are closer to the subjects that they're writing about. But it also means that what we write may not be as theoretically pure, I guess, as a workers' inquiry would have the ability to be if it were done in a more sort of, I guess, I don't want to say abstract, but perhaps in an academic context where it could be entirely self-serving, I suppose, for academic purposes. Or for organizing purposes. I do think that there are ways that the two can inform and sort of mutually aid one another. I think that I draw a lot from what I've learned in academia in terms of the ability to do, rigorous primary source research, or to seek public documents and other things like that. So those are just, basic bread and butter tools that I think can be useful in both fields in this regard. And perhaps with academia, there's a little bit more rigor to the extent that they're applied. But I also think that there's something, you can definitely reach more people when writing a worker story, and probably you'll reach people who will read what you write simply because they want to know what's going on, or because they're curious about the world around them, and not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily be as deliberate a process of knowledge seeking as someone perhaps who was looking at an academic paper or something like that was created out of a workers' inquiry. That being said, I do think that at the end of the day, these are people just writing, and it's to the extent that either academics or journalists can be useful, we're all sort of inserting ourselves as media here, media in the more theoretical sense, as interpreters of people's stories. And so I think that the problems that academics and labor journalists face are similar, in the sense that it's a problem of interpretation, right? It ultimately comes down to, do you have the tools, do you have the know-how, and do you have, I guess, the modesty in some ways to be able to do your subject justice. And I think that one of the things that both maybe the type of journalism that Sarah and I do, and the type of workers' inquiry that we're discussing in this panel today may have in common, is that they want to sort of interrogate that process of interpretation, and also break it down as much as possible, so that we can have workers' voices kind of be in the foreground as much as possible, while also acknowledging our role in sort of in channeling that to a wider audience.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on some of that stuff? Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback off what you were talking about, Jamie, a few minutes ago. In your work on gig workers in the UK, just kind of brings to mind the way I think of the consequences of previous decomposition of previous struggles of workers. The deunionization is a big issue that I know you cover and belabored. The decline of union density, the changing demographics in different sectors of the labor force and so forth. The consequences essentially of 50 years of a new technical composition of capital has essentially meant that many of the restraints on the ability of workers to organize are virtually gone. I like to think of it as no union, no rules. And what you talked about, Jamie, with gig workers and the ability of workers to translate their interpersonal relationships into the basis for organizing is something that we're seeing kind of flower right now. We're seeing a lot of workers in what we normally call the service sector, or what I prefer to say they're doing paid reproductive labor, is they're building upon those relationships they already have in the workplace. And they're doing the typical, sharing their grievances and figuring out how to march on the boss, as Jane McAlevey puts it, and using an old IWW tactic of getting together a core group of workers who know each other and trust each other, and making demands and disrupting the workplace until they get some concessions, and then building upon that and using that as a basis for organizing. And I think what's critical about workers' inquiry is it helps us understand how the organization of work has changed so that new tactics and strategies can be pulled from those new relationships in order to take action. And I want to return back to something I mentioned at the outset about these kind of roaming truckers strike that's been happening for over a month around the United States. It's now spread to multiple states where truckers have been getting on these virtually empty freeways and driving under the speed limit. In some cases, the highway patrol has pulled them over and giving them tickets or told them to speed up. But the reality is that these workers have found a new tactic that they can use after having, for decades, lost their ability to be unionized because of the changing technical composition of the logistics industry. Changes in labor laws going back to the Carter administration in the 1970s, when Carter deregulated trucking and shipping and interstate transport. And after several decades of their wages getting hammered down as much as 70, 80% below what they would be making in real terms if they were still unionized in the Teamsters, is these workers haven't just said, oh, there's nothing we can do, we're just going to get screwed. They've actually gotten together and used their interpersonal relationships to figure out how can we assert our power as a minority of workers in the ports and working for these trucking companies. They're not going around getting a majority of workers to sign a card to unionize. They're using their interpersonal relationships and their understanding of how the trucking industry is organized to give it to the boss. And I think it's really exciting, and understanding how workers are capable of reading the changing structure of their work to figure out ways to respond to that and develop new tactics and strategies is what workers inquiry and class composition theory has to offer us, besides, oh, these are workers that a union is going to come to and ask them to sign up and pay dues. I think this is a shift in the way we think about class struggle and workers organizing. And I think that, the terrain is going to be quite different when we get out of this catastrophic pandemic. We're going to see this kind of flowering of self-organized movements, especially as the global economy crashes. And I think that that's where there's a nice overlap between the work that you're doing with Belabored, is you're going out and finding some of these folks who actually have these great stories to tell about how they have read their working conditions and turn their interpersonal relationships into a new form of organizing, which is essentially the original meaning of what a union is, which is a group of workers getting together around a shared grievance and then making demands and disrupting work until they get some of their demands met. And so I think there's a lot of great overlap there of how you find these folks that are doing this exciting work, and then the stories they have to tell about how they organize, even under these horrific conditions.
So I feel like one of the things that I have to do a lot lately is to point out to people who are newly very excited about class politics and class struggle that the thing that they keep hearing declared is not maybe what they think it is. So I just had to say this because while we were sitting here, I just got another email going like, will there be a general strike? And like, look, I would love it if there was going to be a general strike. It is going to be a long way off. And just going to plug again, because we're doing this talk with Calla Winslow on the last time America had a general strike was 1919 in Seattle. But I don't like to be that person, to be like, this thing that sounds very exciting is maybe not as exciting as we think it is. But one of the useful things that we can do sometimes is to talk about and contextualize these things. Because, you know, before May Day, there were a bunch of articles that were like, there's going to be a historic mass strike of Amazon workers and Instacart workers and whatever on May Day. And there was not a very big strike on May Day of Amazon. There were a few, and that's great. And I support them, and I would like there to be more. But without sort of coming to any of this with some sort of context of like the last 20, 30, 40 years of labor history and law and organizing and attempts to organize warehouse workers and the support or lack thereof that those things have, we get a lot of, I've been joking a lot since the crisis began that everybody's a labor journalist now. But it is a thing that I want to sort of fight for being important as a beat that somebody should dedicate time to, the way Michelle and I and quite a few other people now have done, in order to really, you know, that you can screw somebody's organizing attempt up if you give them a false understanding of the rules under which they operate. So, you know, I don't like to be like, oh, mommy says no, but like the understanding reality was also a big thing that Marx was very big on.
Not to join in the there's not going to be a general strike pylon, but but I also think it's interesting that I don't know. I think there's the way people get excited about strikes in a country where there's, you know, union representation is dwindling, and many people do not have direct connections to organized labor. I think we tend to think about protest in terms of the spectacle of protest, and I think that's why there's always so much excitement around something like, you know, everybody going on strike at once, and I think that also speaks to maybe the naivety and perhaps so kind of the detachment that we face from actual what, you know, workplace struggle looks like on the ground for many people. And, you know, that's not anyone's fault. I think it comes from that sort of the intergenerational erosion of class consciousness, and as well as just sort of the, you know, the basic nuts and bolts of labor representation in this country. So I don't know if other countries are having big headlines about, you know, whether there's going to be a general strike. I somehow doubt it, but I could be wrong. But I also think that perhaps, yeah, the fixation on the spectacle of protest, I think, is something that that maybe a really good type of workers' inquiry or labor journalism should probably be sort of cutting against in some ways, because the process of organizing and struggle in the workplace is slow and often arduous, boring, not particularly sexy, and that's often why labor journalism doesn't pay terribly well, because it requires you to be sort of in the trenches and actually, you know, commit, you know, sort of ethically and intellectually to tracking a group of people that that really, you know, powerful elite institutions often really don't give a shit about. And so I think that perhaps, yeah, maybe the counterweight to this kind of somewhat naive fixation on the general strike would be, you know, what is a way that we could look at some of the smaller victories on the ground that happen for people on a day-to-day basis, and what does that mean for workers' lives and their material conditions in a very real sense.
There's also the counter to all of that is that many of the places that are paying for labor journalism are my former podcast co-host before Michelle came in and made it the beast that it is today, now works for Bloomberg. And Josh still does great labor reporting, but Bloomberg has a labor reporter not because it's on the side of the workers, and that is another reality of our own labor conditions as reporters, is that oftentimes the people who are interested in your story about the workers are the boss who wants to stop that organizing. And so that is like another question of the tension between journalism and organizing practice, the tension between where and when and how we draw the lines and what we're going to get paid, who the audience is, all of that stuff. I think that these are real questions that I don't have easy answers to. It's mostly just like the stuff that we struggle with every day.
Yeah, we often have very similar issues at Notes from Below, because often it's workers talking about their experience at work, but also their experience organizing. And that organizing tactics are not always ones that you want to be made public. So we've had to have some real in-depth conversations with people of like this specific kind of maybe like sabotage or workarounds on an app. Like, these the kind of things that we want to be publicizing? And often it's like, ooh, no, let's leave that to the WhatsApp groups. And when we're putting out a bulletin that's going to go to thousands of workers across London, we should probably not include that. But it really struck a chord with me what you said, Michelle, about there being this real gap in knowledge between the like labor movement and maybe the like more traditionally organized left. We've seen really similar in this country recently. No one's talking about a general strike at the moment at all. But what we've found is with the increasing pressure to go back to work, all of a sudden people are digging up bits of health and safety legislation, which even in the labor movement, we're not even that familiar with. But lefties have been publicizing this on Twitter, and it's like, this one quick trick, just talk about this one bit of legislation and you don't have to go to work. But actually the story is so much deeper, and it's really something that us who are like interested in the labor movement or involved really need to be pushing of, if we want to use this piece of health and safety legislation, it's not a one quick fix. We need to have organized workforces. We need to be organized with our colleagues to be able to enforce not going to work on the basis of health and safety. And this is the kind of really tired drum that we just have to keep banging, because I think people maybe not involved in the movement aren't quite getting it, or they've never been through such like rigorous organizing process before. So yeah, that really struck a chord with me, Michelle, of how we just have to bang that drum again and again of we need to be organized in our workplaces to enforce our collective rights. It's not as easy as a general strike or this tiny bit of legislation that means you don't have to go to work during coronavirus.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add to all of this is there seems to be a question around, like, I guess two things. So one of them has to do with the different ways that workers' inquiry and labor journalism offer different modes of distribution, or like along different channels, in the sense that there's, I think, the ability for labor journalism to distribute to a different group of people than workers' inquiry. And like you were pointing out, Lydia, maybe there's certain things that are for workers' bulletins and other things that are for WhatsApp groups and other things that are for Bloomberg Magazine, right? And sort of trying to think about the way that all of these channels are really important in terms of conveying a message and trying to understand the experience and struggle of work. But just thinking about managing those channels of distribution, I think is like really important. I think one of the points of synthesis between something like labor journalism and workers' inquiry. But I'm also, like, as someone that's involved in organizing in my union as a grad student, like, that idea of slow movement building is very apparent in sort of everyday life for me. But also something that you mentioned earlier, Jamie, is how quickly some of the gig workers seemed like they could strike in the face of more traditional labor organizers or trade unionists that also are the same people that are pushing that very slow and steady methodical organizing. And I don't think it's to say that, fast is better than slow or anything like that, but just to say that there are these different perspectives and these things that need to be held together at the same time around expectations and opportunity. And there's I think, as we've all pointed out, there's no easy answer to any of this stuff, but it's that tension that I think needs to be held or worked through in sort of each step of the way.
Speaking in terms of grad student organizing, I think I mean, that's an interesting example. And I think with a lot of precarious labor, it's often the case that turnover is so high, or people are only grad students for a few years before they move on to their next thing, right? So that it also that alters sort of your horizon of expectation as well, right? If workers are only expected to be working in a particular job for 3 months or a year, if that, then how does that change our expectations and our strategies? Whether you're an organizer or you're looking to chronicle a movement, or simply, looking to sort of undertake an inquiry with a worker who may not be there next week, right? So all these things also need to be taken into account. I think the way workplace dynamics shift in today's economy is also, at a much faster and less predictable rate in some ways. And so I think the labor movement perhaps would in that sense benefit from being a little bit more nimble.
Yeah. So I want to make sure we get to some audience questions before we wrap up here. So the first one that I have, which is for Lydia and Jamie, is what would you go over, or what can people expect from the workshops that you mentioned? Would you be interested in working with workers that are outside of the UK, or is geography a determinant factor?
So it's a great question. I mean, we've been kind of experimenting with the format of the workshops, and I think really the first thing that we go over is that people's experience matters. That, I guess, to kind of riff off the previous discussion we've been having of, like, you have to understand how your work is organized, and that matters for what you write about, but it also matters about how you organize. And so we kind of have planned this like skeleton structure for workshops, which we're very happy to send to people, which has a set of questions for people to ask each other, some kind of discussion points, some kind of working stuff through. And we're really pleased that some comrades in India used it for a workers' inquiry workshop in Bangalore. So we've already managed to get it out into another country and have it tested out. But I think really the idea about this stuff is lots of people are told that their opinions don't matter about work, that they can't have a say over their work, that they don't have anything interesting to say. And so I think a lot of this is about telling people that their experience about this stuff matters, as a kind of first step towards organizing.
And for the grant, we've already got a few people outside the UK who have signed up for the grant, workers that we're in touch with before. So if you're interested, it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to the UK. We've got some great, how would you describe the work?
Online micro work.
Online micro workers who by their very nature are remote workers anyway. So yeah, totally cool. Get in touch if you want to get involved.
Great. And actually, as a follow-up to that, I think, Robert, if you could mention the Workers Inquiry Network. I think you mentioned that earlier. Is that something that other people can get involved with, or how would people go about that if they're interested?
Well, if you're already doing workers' inquiry, or you're interested in learning more about it, I think you'd be welcome to join our calls. How would people get in touch with us, Jamie, Lydia? I guess maybe your good contacts through the Notes from Below website, maybe.
Yeah, if I could just add just a 2-seconder onto that. The Workers' Inquiry Network is it's a network of groups in different places, and we have an email list. If people want to find out more, one of the things we've we've said that we'd be really happy to do is if people want to set up their own workers' inquiry group to share experiences from our group and from others about how to do it. So if you email us at editors@notesfrombelow, we'd be very happy to hopefully offer some advice.
Great. And the next question, which I think can sort of be addressed to whoever is interested in taking it, but it's how do you think general working conditions will change over the next couple of years as capital tries to recompose itself to mitigate and respond to what Mike Davis has called the age of pandemics?
Short version, working conditions are going to get worse. But the question of whether capital wants to mitigate it is an interesting question. I mean, because I don't think that a lot of people do really care what happens to their workers. I can't count at this point how many people have said to me, they say we're essential, but what that really means is we're expendable or we're sacrificial. But it is a growing number of people who have made that comment to me or to Michelle. So yeah, I almost just want to say that, like, assuming that capital wants to mitigate this is a real stretch.
I think Robert made a great point earlier of, it's not about them mitigating it. This is really about people using a crisis, bosses using a crisis to their own ends. And in the union that I work for, we're seeing it already. Like from day one, we were seeing this. We were seeing cleaners who were getting sacked and then hired back on more precarious contracts. This is purely using this crisis to worsen terms and conditions straight off the bat. At the moment, we're engaged in this real struggle over some medical couriers who are literally delivering COVID-19 samples throughout this crisis, so-called key workers, who lots of people were saying, they're so much more valued. Something's got to change after the crisis. We've got to value them more. And instead, we find that they've been put on a track for redundancy. And it's a clear attack on the union. They're the push bikes at this medical courier company, and they are the real ones who started agitating and started unionizing and won a struggle with a really successful strike in 2018. And even before this crisis, there were suspicions that they were going to try and make them redundant and push them out. And then the moment this crisis hit, sure enough, like clockwork, the company is using it to push out these unionized workers. So I think it's a really a great point you made, Robert, of we can just see that all the designs that bosses have to reshape the workforce, to make it more precarious, make it more flexible for their own means, to make it cheaper, are going to be actualized, or they will be actualized if people aren't organized and they aren't fighting back from the get-go.
If I could jump in also, I think we should be thinking about this very tool that we're using to hold this webinar. Zoom itself has seen its usage increase 500% since the beginning of the pandemic, and it had just previously been taken over by a hedge fund. Now, why should we worry about these new technologies, particularly for what's called homework or remote work or teleconferencing? Because of the immense amount of data that's generated through these technologies that mediate our work. This data is being integrated with social media data, with biometrics, with credit data, and it's being packaged and sold to employers. And so having now hundreds of millions of more students, professional workers, those who can work remotely, immense amount of information is being accumulated that can be used to discipline and control and impose labor on those workers working remotely in a way that makes us more and more similar to the use of data in the workplace, say at Amazon, where every motion of a worker is constantly being tracked and data is being accumulated, and AI is being used to increase the intensity and the productivity of their labor. So we're going to see more and more of these kinds of technologies seeping into areas of the labor force from top to bottom in terms of skill level or wage hierarchies or what have you.
To try and be ever the optimist as well, we've had a great experience this week of, even though Zoom can be used for a million evil things, I'm sure, this week in the UK, we've had the biggest union meeting, I think, ever recorded on history, where 20,000 teachers from the teachers union were on a collective union meeting Zoom call. And I think something mad numbers of like thousands of reps were signed up right there and then on the spot. Their whole website crashed. And we're seeing these technologies being used for like really interesting and innovative ways of organizing, often from like quite old unions that maybe have like been stuck in a bit of a rut or like haven't done as much recently. So I think that's like exciting. I'm trying to be ever the optimist after being a bit of a downer.
Yeah, and on that note, Lydia, thanks for the positive reminder. We're doing this in higher education as well in Northern California. A new coalition is formed called Higher Educators United that brings together representatives and rank and file organizers of academic labor unions throughout Northern California. And if I could announce on June 11th from 1 to 4 Pacific Standard Time, we're going to be holding a webinar on how to organize in higher education during the pandemic. So indeed, these tools are both a blessing and a curse at the same time.
I was going to say there have been a lot of union meetings for the Professional Staff Congress at CUNY, which is where I teach, maybe not for much longer, but they're also laying off like 25% of their faculty. So in terms of, I guess, like in light of those, massive shifts in the workforce, it seems like, I mean, I guess I'm kind of agnostic on the technology aspect. I think any means of, letting workers communicate more, more easily during a time when there's such massive disruption in workforces is important. Going back to the question that we were asked about how, what to do as capitalism tries to sort of reconfigure itself in the post-pandemic era. I don't know that there's like a deliberate, I don't know that capital itself is sort of acting as a unified whole right now, like to rearrange itself to kind of, further exploit workers. But I think that like capitalism is like one of those self-healing fabrics where like you puncture it and it'll sort of like the nanoparticles will naturally like form and heal themselves. And so it's a bit like that. I mean, I think we're just going to see an acceleration of the trends that are sort of already in place. But I think that if there are changes as a result of the suffering that we're witnessing right now in the pandemic, I think it might be more on the political side, and I mean, in the sense that there's at least there's some discussion of things like expanding unemployment benefits for gig workers and things like that. I mean, those are all things that are they're tiny in terms of what actually needs to be done, but I think that the political discourse around how society should perhaps reconfigure either its social safety net or some of the institutions that people rely on to kind of buffer themselves against these periodic catastrophes, that might be where there might be more opportunity to actually see more sort of concrete change. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen unless there's the political will to do it, and that will probably rely on massive organizing again. But I think that in terms of the political discourse, I also think that perhaps it's not so much capital itself kind of sort of really exploiting this moment. I think capital will do what it needs to do to maximize its exploitation, but I do think right-wing forces in society are going to capitalize on this moment, and they're currently doing that in the US at least, and perhaps in other parts of the world as well. But we see sort of, I think that this the panic and the division that is currently being sown across the country right now is ultimately probably going to militate against any kind of militate against worker solidarity, unfortunately. And so I think that what the right tries to do in terms of exploiting this crisis is probably perhaps an equal or larger threat.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just sort of to tack on to that as a way to sort of wrap some of this stuff up is that, you know, like at Red May, we're interested in the strategies and the tactics that people can use today to sort of improve their lives and sort of reconfigure the social world. And you know, I wonder if people are seeing any of those things happening that are a little bit more positive, particularly, you know, around having these large Zoom meetings or being able to increase worker communication. But I think particularly for me, it's interesting to think about the ways that both labor journalism and workers' inquiry can be operationalized currently as a way to make connections between the people that have recently just been laid off, right? Or the people that have recently lost work. Because I think that one of the clear ways that capital is reconfiguring sort of from above the social composition or the technical composition of the workplace is like it's in a crisis, there's slow growth. There's fewer, like, jobs aren't being produced at the pace at which you would assume that they would be. So that there's just going to be people that are unemployed. So how to make those connections through these sort of lenses that are focused on work.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just say a couple of things that we've been doing in the UK, I guess, to try and continue Lydia's upbeat everything. You know, there are definite possibilities in the midst of a crisis and so on. Is the union that Lydia works for and that I'm also a part of. One of the initiatives that we've been doing recently is to establish a kind of general members branch and to try connecting people up who are, you know, looking at the news, hopefully good labor journalism, but you know, may not also be, but looking at the news, talking to their colleagues and thinking, I really wish I'd been organizing, and like now I'm going to have the first step towards doing it, and thinking about how we can open up some of the structures of the labor movement in ways that they might not have existed before. So to say, you don't fit into our structure right now, but like we'll find a way to help you. And so for the last, you know, this has really been one of the things that's been keeping me going through quarantine. It's like being on the phone with people who are like, I really want to organize. What should I do? And just having those like first ABC conversations. And a lot of that, I think we can learn from workers' inquiry too, is, you know, those first moments are like a moment of inquiry. Who do you work for? How many people work there? What's the major grievance? And like taking those things, but then saying to people, like, you need to go and do something about it. And I think during this crisis, there's a moment where, like, if we're ambitious and we're confident, you know, I think we can pull off things with people that we might have taken longer to do before or might have been harder to do.
Great. So I think that about wraps us up, unless people have any last thoughts or comments. It's been a blast. I've really appreciated getting to talk with all of you today. And if there's nothing else, I'll pass it over to Philip, who will send us off.
So, hey, Lydia, there's a British artist who lives in Seattle named James Coop, who did a project called Only Human, which involved 1-minute videos from mechanical Turk workers around the world. I should put you guys in touch. I did have a question. You know, thinking about what Sarah said about presenting labor to the middle class and what Michelle was talking about in terms of the possible deceptions of narrative and so forth. And particularly on the question between representation and inquiry. But I'll bring it down to a much simpler level. What do you think of film and video as a tool, and what's a film that each of you have found interesting, inspired, or no, not inspiring. That's the wrong word. That's absolutely the wrong word. The word should be sort of informative or engrossing. The reason I'm thinking about that at the moment is I started to watch a streaming series, French, called Inhuman Resources. And I'm struck whenever I watch certain French films like 2 Days, One Night or whatever, how naked and brutal the war at work is and is portrayed in those films. There's none of this quirky hominess of sitcominess or the boss playing practical jokes on the boss or whatever it is that's put in to make you identify or so forth. It's brutal in a way that is shocking, even though I know from reading Marx and from work it's brutal. You realize how that's leached out so much. So I'm wondering, in terms of what you see, what, without denying that the Erin Brockoviches or the Norma Rays have some use whatsoever, what are the things that you find, very interesting for you, and what do you find maybe misleading in terms of film and video, just from each person?
Okay. The first thing that I thought of when you said film and video was that one of the Postmates drivers that I spoke to, who was on a strike, was also a filmmaker, and she had used her filmmaking talents to make a short video about the strike. So I find that, that was a really interesting overlapping of many things about her working conditions, right? That, her day job, sort of the thing she thinks of herself as is a filmmaker, right? But the thing that often pays the bills, especially right now when she can't be a filmmaker, is this gig work. But she could actually use this other thing that she had the skill to do that. And then yesterday was the anniversary of the actual Matewan massacre. So I've got to just give a shout out to that movie, which is one of the probably only good films about class war. And speaking of brutal, certainly does not stint on that aspect of things.
John Sayles, okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a favorite movie or something?
Well, just to kind of feed off of how terrifying work is, I think Sorry We Missed You, I think captures that really well. It doesn't have the organizing element to it, but it's like a workers' inquiry told in a dramatization form. And I just can't even emphasize how terrifying virtually every scene change is in that movie, where you just see this family moving through two precarious jobs and the terror of how it impacts their family life and their friendships and their intimate relationships with their children and each other. Just terrifying, but unfortunately leaves you almost disempowered. And I think human resources is a good counter to that. And there are several others as well, but I would encourage that latest one to be watched as part of even a training to see how do you understand the changes in the conditions of work.
I'm going to go for a semi-serious one. This is something me and Jamie have been talking about a lot recently, and we touched on it a bit earlier, workers telling their own stories and what forms that can take. Like, does it have to be a long thousands of words article, or can it be like a podcast or a video? And this is something we've been talking about in relation to TikTok. Yeah, I'm showing myself to be the millennial that I am. But I'm semi-joking, but also semi-serious. There are some amazing channels on TikTok where it's really young people. They're talking about their work. They're expressing real frustration with their work. And they're engaging with other people who do really similar kinds of work. There's this one amazing channel where it's a woman who works in a call center, and she's doing kind of skits and pretending to be the people that she talks on the phone to every day. And you have other people chiming in who also work in call centers and engaging with her hilarious criticism, which is funny, but also like she is kind of laying the groundwork for some wider organizing. maybe I'm being way too optimistic, but that's my kind of silly video of some kind of work organizing that I've been enjoying during quarantine. And I can see Sarah saying in the chat, you also love TikTok, so thank you. Do you have anything?
I mean, there's no way I can top the call center TikTok, so I think I'll leave it.
Michelle, do you have a favorite thing in film and video that you like?
Oh no, Michelle.
I knew that was going to happen. But yeah, I actually, I was just thinking about this kind of really long and kind of disturbing documentary film called We the Workers that was came out a couple of years ago. But it was just looking at sort of the really sort of long and arduous and kind of like really often, violent sort of process of organizing workers in China and doing that sort of with the constraints of how little of an independent labor movement there is. But that, I mean, I guess that I think the thing, I didn't even actually enjoy the movie itself very much, but I thought it was a good, because it was so long and painful, it kind of just, I thought it was like a good lesson in how, worker organizing is not really about sort of quick, spectacular victories, but sort of about the sort of day-to-day kind of slog of doing that, having it be your reality and having to live and breathe it all the time, no matter what the cost. So, but I guess, I wish now I just want to get on TikTok though, because it seems like a much better way to be entertained and become inspired than watching 2-hour documentaries. So.
I think TikTok has won the day here. But Sarah, that reminds me of the filmmaker at work is Godard and Chris Marker in '68 formed this thing called the Medvedkin Group, where they essentially took, the idea was to just give cameras to workers at work or on strike, and basically teach them how to use it and have them, so maybe that should happen again now. Well, we could go on. And I tend to go on, so I won't go on. I will just thank all of our panelists for an absolutely awesome session, and encourage people to look on our website, redmayseattle.org, to see what else is coming up. Tomorrow we have Out of the Woods with Alyssa Battistoni and then at 5 o'clock tonight, we have System Crash, What Next with Doug Henwood, Jody Dean, Leo Panich, and Asad Haider. And Friday night, What Was Liberalism? So a lot of good stuff. And to keep doing good stuff, we need money. So please go either to our website or go to YouTube, click on the donate button. We are like Blanche Dubois. We depend on the kindness of strangers. So I bid you adieu till tomorrow.